Welcome, I'm Glenn Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glenn's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glenn's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glenn's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's interview on Glenn's Parallax Perspectives provides you with a powerful, inspiring, exciting worldwide campaign that is already making progress toward abolishing nuclear weapons. American politicians and American news media have grossly failed to inform the American people about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly approved this treaty in July 2017. As of the date that we're taping this TV interview on January 20th, 2021, 51 nations have ratified the treaty. The treaty is going into effect on January 22, 2021. During this hour, an exceptionally well-informed guest, Joanne Dafour, will explain what the treaty does, how it came into being, how it fits into international law, and how we can help it move forward worldwide toward actually abolishing all nuclear weapons. This is exciting. Joanne Dafour has a long background in the peace movement, including firsthand experience volunteering directly with the United Nations in New York. She's an active member of the Olympia Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in Olympia, Washington, along with a bunch of other people, including me. Welcome, Joanne. I'm glad that you are here.
Well, Glenn, I am too, and I want to thank you for not only inviting me, but certainly programming this topic, because it's an especially important topic at this time.
It's really exciting worldwide, even though the U.S. news media and U.S. politicians are trying to ignore it. So let's start, Joanne, with a brief overview about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons before we share more information about it specifically. But briefly, what is the treaty and what does it intend to do?
Well, the treaty, remember, the treaty is a contract. And this is a contract among nations. And the nations that are ratifying this treaty have one goal in mind, and that is to totally eliminate nuclear weapons worldwide. Now, that is the intent. And it might not yet be considered realistic, except there are other treaties that have preceded with such lofty goals and have made an incredible difference. Right. So now it's time for us to do the same kind of work with nuclear weapons, and it's exciting that this is happening.
Yeah, and we'll mention some of those other treaties in a few minutes. So the treaty that we're proposing here, even though it is historically very significant, it's not beyond the realm of possibility to actually accomplish. So this is what's practical and realistic about this, as well as exciting. In July 2017, by an overwhelming majority of 3/5 of the world's nations, 122 of the world's 193 nations in the General Assembly approved the treaty in the UN General Assembly, and then it became available for nations to sign the treaty and to ratify the treaty on a nation by nation basis. And we're taping this program now on January 20th of 2021. As of today, 51 nations have ratified it. So this will become part of their national laws starting on January 22 of 2021, when it goes into effect for those nations. Joanne, why is this treaty significant for the world?
Well, because first of all, when the United Nations took the vote, what they actually did was not necessarily to approve the treaty. Individual countries have to do that when they ratify it. But they opened up the chance that we are actually looking forward to a future when there will be no nuclear weapons. There was enough of a voice over time developing among the nations of the world that this became their demand. They actually wanted to have this treaty written and open up for signatures, even though the countries that had nuclear weapons in no way, shape, or form approved of what they were doing. And yet those countries persevered. And they said, we're going to be the ones, if you guys play around with nuclear weapons and detonate them, we're going to be impacted. And that is just not acceptable.
Yeah.
So that's and making something illegal in the world in international law opens up the door for what they call customary law. That means that down the road, even if countries haven't signed on to the treaty, they begin to reconfigure themselves to abide by the treaty. So
Yeah.
this is the hope. This has happened before with other weapons of mass destruction, and now it's going to happen. We hope that it'll happen with nuclear weapons as well.
Yeah, it's a massive historical shift of consciousness, a raising of consciousness among the world's nations that puts moral pressure on the 9 nations that do have nuclear weapons. And I think it's interesting that this occurred in the General Assembly, which is the most democratic part of the United Nations, whereas the Security Council is dominated by big, powerful militaristic nations, including nations that have nuclear weapons and have veto power over it. This came up through the General Assembly. So it's the nations of the world speaking really with one voice, saying we got to stop this. And we'll talk
And they
more about
purposely targeted it through the General Assembly for that very reason.
yeah.
And the beauty of the fact of the nuclear powers not wanting to participate was a wonderful opportunity for including the language in the treaty that they would probably not want.
Right.
But they didn't participate, so they couldn't stop it. And the treaty, the beauty of the treaty is its breadth. It's not, nuclear weapons are already illegal. They've been made illegal by the Geneva Conventions. So that really isn't a new part of the treaty, but all the other wording that is included is what makes this thing very special.
Right, and we'll cover that in just a few minutes. So we're getting into the next question I wanted to ask you about, which is about the origins of the treaty. Everybody who's heard you speak firsthand about your experience with the United Nations respects your knowledge about what the United Nations does, how it functions, and especially its work for peace and disarmament. Can you tell us about how the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into being even before it came to the UN General Assembly? What were the origins going back years?
Okay, well, it's a great story. In 50 years ago, because countries that had the weapons were worried that they might be put in the hands of more and more countries and didn't want to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, they signed a treaty called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And when they signed it, they wanted to say that, okay, those countries that have it, will work to protect countries, and they won't need to design their own weaponry. We'll just actually protect them, and we will hope that the world will not get carried away with more countries getting the weapons. Well, in order to check that, every 10 years they would have a check-in meeting. Okay. And in
let
2010,
me just mention the grand bargain in the NPT, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is in order to stop the proliferation into more nations that have nuclear weapons, the nations that did have nuclear weapons agreed to promptly make real progress toward eliminating them. This is 50 years ago, and the nuclear weapons nations have been dragging their feet for half a century, and the rest of the world said enough is enough. We're going to hold your feet to the fire and do this from the bottom up. So that the grand bargain of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is now being acted upon by the rest of the world.
well, it actually reached in the 2010 meeting. It actually wasn't something that people thought about. In the 2010 treaty, it actually was brought up as a topic of discussion, and about 40 nations that didn't have anything to do with nuclear weapon were worried, that if any activity occurred, they would be impacted without any resistance. I mean, they couldn't resist; they were powerless, and they didn't like being put in that position. So that started as a discussion in 2010. The discussion was not going to get buried. It got continued on, and it was encouraged in special meetings that were held in 2013 and 2014. By the time 2015 came around, the number of countries that were now interested in the idea of maybe we can eliminate the possibility of even having nuclear weapons. And now the number was growing from 60 to 70 to 100. So that by 2017, when a decision was made to actually write the treaty itself, and the resistance to the fact that this Article 6, which is what you were referring to in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which says that, okay, you guys have your nuclear weapons, but you must disarm and work towards elimination of nuclear weapons. Well, of course, they hadn't done it. And so the exasperation was so high that they decided we're going to have a treaty. And if those countries that have weapons want to participate, they can, but they chose not to. So a treaty was drafted in 2016 and was actually opened up for signature. And that's the process that goes on in the United Nations. Step one is that you sign on to a treaty. And when you sign on to a treaty, you're essentially saying, yes, I'm interested. I want to begin to think about bringing this back to my home country, because of course, all the ambassadors there are representing their home countries. And the next step is to bring that back to whatever legislature or parliament, whatever your own constitution in your own country says is the process for ratifying a treaty. So that process actually opened up in September of 2017. And that's when 122 countries voted to open up the treaty for signatures. Well, there are some countries that very day not only signed but ratified the treaty. And they're, of course, the heroes because they started the process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's essentially was the birth of the treaty.
Yeah, thanks. So since the 2017, we should also mention the organization worldwide that was a major promoter of this, the
International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Yes.
Yeah, ICAN. And the
they
website
were recognized in 2017 by getting the Nobel Peace Prize. Right. Things don't necessarily happen at the United Nations among the nations themselves. There is a partner of organizations that are called the non-governmental organizations. Remember, the UN is composed of governmental representatives, and they don't always necessarily do the will of the public, but the will of the public is often done by non-governmental organizations. Yeah. And so this particular organization decided that it was going to be their cause to look at some of the other treaties that had been drafted, which were successful in actually stopping the spread of a particular weapon of mass destruction successfully. So there was already a pattern and a procedure that they could copy and follow. And
Right.
that's exactly what ICANN did.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there was this treaty that was drafted and was now opening up for signature was an indication of the success that this non-governmental organization had.
Yeah.
And that's why they got the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, and if people want more information about ICANN, you can visit their website, which is www.icanw.org. And the process that you described, Joanne, we'll cover in just a few minutes when we talk about other treaties. So again, this thing about nuclear weapons is not just a pie in the sky, unrealistic, visionary thing. It's really part of a long historical sequence that we'll cover in just a moment. I want to ask you right now if you could summarize what has occurred since the UN General Assembly approved the treaty in July 2017. Can you tell us something about various nations ratifying it, the expansion of support worldwide for this?
Well, we said that the first step is signing on, okay? And then the second step, these are ambassadors now that all own in the UN saying this is a great idea. Now they have to go back to their own country and try to convince their own country, let's sign on to this. Because when you sign on to it, that is the enforcement part of a treaty. Now, every treaty that has been made has some kind of condition of ratification. How many countries have to sign on to this arrangement in order for it to become international law? It just can't be 2 countries alone. You need a number of countries, especially if it's an important issue like this that affects the world. You need a number of countries to sign on. Well, when they wrote this treaty, they came up with the number of 50. Some treaties might have 60, some treaties might have 70. They're all different. They are decided when the treaty is drafted. So now they open it up. The very first day, there were 3 countries that signed on immediately. One was the Vatican, one was Thailand, and one was Guyana in South America. And so they are the heroes and leading the way. Of course, now ICANN and all the NGOs that are going to be very much interested in seeing this treaty come into fruition are going to start to begin to lobby their own governments, because these are going to be groups around the world that are going to be lobbying their own governments to take the next step. Let's see if we will be among the 50 that ratify this treaty. Now, as it turns out, the ratification process had not only the smaller countries that were going to be ratifying it, the ones that really had no option whatsoever to ever consider creating a nuclear weapon or wanting any part of this whole nuclear package. But some of the countries that ratified it did walk down that road and had decided they wanted to give it up. Countries like South Africa, countries like the Ukraine, countries like, what was the third one? It'll come to me, but anyway.
Kazakhstan had the Soviet Union.
Oh, Kazakhstan, thank you, yes, because they had the nuclear, they were part of the testing procedure of for the Russians as well. But anyway, but there were large countries too. I mean, countries with large populations as well as countries with very, very small populations. So you got countries like Brazil or Nigeria to sign on. So you had a range of a really diverse from all over the world countries that were going to be included in that first 50. And that's what makes it so exciting. It wasn't just one particular part of the world that wanted it. No. The cross-section was very, very impactful, except for the Europeans. Even though the Europeans have the densest collection of nuclear weapons on both sides because of the Russian-United States contention. And many of them are positioned against the other side in Europe. Those are the countries that are still not not among the biggest supporters.
Right. Well, yeah, and the United States has U.S. nuclear weapons in a number of European countries that are NATO members, and
So
but
does Russia. Yeah.
yeah, and the interestingly, out of the 51 nations that have ratified it thus far, 49 are in the global South, and so uh, uh, this really is something that's being led by the global South, as the climate crisis uh, has been affecting the global South even more than the North, and a lot of the leadership on the climate has come from nations in the global South. So we need to be alert to that. We're a bit tight on time, but I do want you to be able to tell us something about how this fits into international law. You've mentioned some of this already, but you're a great expert on international law, and especially international humanitarian law. And I want the public to understand a bit more about how international treaties are part of international law, and that when a nation ratifies a treaty, it embeds the implications into their own national laws. Can you summarize this in a pretty brief chunk of time? And then we'll move on to some more global aspects.
Okay, now treaties can be made by anywhere from 2 countries to any one of a number of countries. You know, there are 191 nations that are part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so the idea of we don't have any enforcement mechanism in the world. The United Nations can be a forum for legislation and the encouragement of treaties, but they don't have an enforcement piece. The enforcers are the ones who ratify it, because they bring that into their own domestic system. And that means that they have to follow the stipulations of the treaty. And that becomes the enforcement arm. So that becomes a very, very important piece. And when you say, what is international law? Really, it's the collection of thousands and thousands of treaties over time that have been drafted, bilateral treaties as well as multilateral treaties. Those are housed in the UN. When any country or set of countries decides they're going to formulate a treaty, that's where it lands up. And so the UN is not the enforcer, it's just the collector.
Okay, that
Right?
helps. Thanks. At the global level, this treaty is really very significant for raising the world's consciousness about nuclear weapons. And it also, besides just that kind of a moral consciousness raising thing, it also is significant for promoting positive changes in global politics and economics. And I wonder if you could say something about that, about those aspects.
Okay, well, one of the aspects, remember that the countries that were complaining about it were not countries that were part of the competitive game of trying to outdo some other country with weapons. You know, the game that India and Pakistan would play, or that Russia and the United States would play. Okay. So these are countries that wanted to live in peace without the threat of being annihilated, just in case the countries that had the weapons were going to detonate them. So what you're really getting was a look at a humanitarian perspective. Why should we die in a war that you have, or in some kind of action that you are taking against the country that we had nothing to do with? Why should our lives be jeopardized? Our lives count. And so that whole humanitarian approach was going to be something that is really new to any kind of consideration of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are supposed to deter other countries from using nuclear weapons. Well, there are only 9 countries involved in this game. So why are these powerful countries bullying the rest of the world, which is essentially what they were doing?
Yeah.
And those countries are speaking out saying, no more. No. I mean, we deserve to live just as much as you do.
Right.
And that's going to be the new focus.
So this is a very interesting, different kind of power balance. Those of us who lived through the Cold War remember that power balance, that power struggle between 2 nuclear nations that were trying to be the preeminent in the world. Now this is about the non-nuclear nations saying, hey, there's a power struggle between you folks who are oppressing and endangering our lives, versus us folks who really are the majority of the world saying, no, we're done with that, and we want some accountability here. So this is a very powerful refiguring of power imbalances.
That's the beauty of it. I mean, we really are recognizing that we all live in the same world.
Yeah.
And just because we happen to be a larger nation doesn't necessarily give us rights over the range of smaller nations. They have every right to live just as we do.
Yeah. One of the
And
signs,
that's the beauty. Yeah.
yeah, one of the signs I enjoy holding at our weekly peace vigils says, "We all share one world." And people walk by as pedestrians or they drive by as motorists, and they like it. They honk and wave. They're happy to see, yes, we do all share one world. Let's start acting like that. And Americans tend to think that we're exempt from the realities of the rest of the world, but we really are part of it. This treaty really fits into a historical sweep, as you alluded to already, and we'll talk about further. Right now, I wonder if you could just briefly summarize the exciting thing that happened in 1928, when the world actually outlawed war. Tell us, if you can tell that story briefly.
Well, when we learn about, or when we teach about, for that matter, because I'm an old social studies teacher, about World War I, you realize all the changes that took place in having that war occur. First of all, the number of countries. There was never a world war before then. There was never a war in which suddenly civilians could be targeted. They were included. Wars before then were armed forces fighting armed forces, be they on land or on sea. But it was a game, as it were, between people who were the military. But that changed in World War I with the expansive use of a whole new range of weaponry and a whole new range of targets. And so when that war was over and people were relieved, what came out of the experience of having lived through that war was really a call to peace. And peace became on the minds of many people as they thought back and recognized all the shell shock that was being suffered by the people who actively took part in war. They actually had to coin a word for it after that, because there were so many people who had participated. They didn't want to live through that again. And so the concept of peace became pervasive on the minds of all kinds of people, especially people in Europe, where there was a concentrated effort of the war, but as well as in America. And so there was interest in actually writing a treaty that would outlaw war. And this treaty was going to be known as by the names of two diplomats who were very, very instrumental and won Nobel Prizes, matter of fact, at that time for their work. One was the Secretary of State, and his name was Secretary of State Kellogg. And then there was a Minister of Defense in France, and his name was Aristide Briand. And those two men were essentially in when you look back on it, they received the praise for drafting this treaty. And the treaty opened up for signature, and it was September 27th, 1928, and 36 countries signed on to it. Back at that time, my gosh, they had the League of Nations, but this is going to exceed the numbers of countries in the League of Nations. And this is going to be very, very exciting. And for a while, there were countries that were really resolute in never having war again. Instead, if you had a conflict, well, try to work it out. Try to use diplomacy. Just don't think of resorting to war. And if you can do that, well, you might actually have a world of peace. Of course, not every country agreed. And then by the time we had the 1930s, there were countries that were going to say, well, we got aggravated enough about what happened that we're going to resort to war. But that Kellogg-Briand Pact was so instrumental in introducing the concept of international law, which was law that all countries agreed to abide by. And by 1934, there were 63 countries that had signed on, and there were going to be more countries that signed on to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, even into the 1960s and 70s and 90s. They can still sign on to it. The UN, when the UN Declaration, when the UN Charter was written in 1945, they actually borrowed words, word for word, from the Kellogg-Briand Pact to put into the charter. So this quest for peace is just as important as the quest for disarmament, which
Right.
is an ongoing quest of the world.
Thank you. I want to bring up a screen.
There
Okay,
you go.
so the kind of thing that we're talking about, these multilateral treaties, there's some that I can just mention here briefly. The world really has adopted a number of powerful treaties for peace, and so the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons flows naturally into this series of treaties that have banned other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. And you'll see over the past half century, biological weapons were banned by treaty in 1972. Chemical weapons were banned by treaty in 1973. Landmines in 97, cluster bombs in 2008, and now we have nuclear weapons that are on the table, and we're trying to get nations to ratify that. And also, you can see in 2002, the Rome Treaty established the International Criminal Court. So there is another significant thing. I want to show you.
Yeah, let me just
Go
add
ahead.
is that one of the interesting things about these treaties for mass destruction, it doesn't mean that all of the biological weapons have been completely eradicated. But you find out that if they are ever used, it becomes news. Why does it become news? Because the majority of biological weapons have been eliminated. The same thing with chemical weapons. About 90% of the chemical weapons have been destroyed over the face of the earth. Now, that's a considerable change in being threatened with the use of chemical weapons. And that's the same kind of thinking. And it was the Chemical Weapons Treaty that was really the prototype that ICANN was looking at to replicate with the Nuclear Weapons Treaty. One piece that was missing, which the Chemical Weapons Treaty was really effective in using, was the verification piece. How do you verify that a country is, in fact, enforcing the provisions of the treaty? And that is lacking from this particular treaty because that's kind of like the hardest part. So they are figuring out, we'll have to handle that in step 2, after we get the treaty to say that nuclear weapons are illegal and all of these provisions are illegal within the treaty. Then we'll work on the verification issue. And that's going to be the next step.
Okay. Now, I want to let folks know also that the U.S. Constitution says that international treaties become the supreme law of the land. And the Constitution says, this is, see, Article 6, Clause 2, the Constitution and laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, and anything, and it goes on and on. So the point is that this treaty does become, if the United States were to ratify it, it will become the law of the land and have the full force of the law.
Lest we forget, Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that we have signed and we are supposed to enforce says that all nations that have nuclear weapons must work for their elimination.
Yeah.
And we have not done that at all. So we already have that within our frame of reference. We don't have to sign on to a new treaty to eliminate those weapons.
Right.
We just have to enforce that provision that the countries that have drafted this treaty and signed on and ratified this treaty are saying, well, you get to do it. You've had 50 years.
Yeah.
And you haven't done it.
You've been violating it for half a century, and the rest of the world says enough is enough. I want to ask a bit more here about international humanitarian law. Joanne, you know a lot about international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and I enjoyed having you as a guest on my March 2020 TV program. when we spend an hour informing the public about that, and people can watch that through my blog. Can you help our TV viewers understand about international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions? What are some basic principles? And I'll see if I can bring up something on the screen here to share about that. Just a second.
Well, one of the pieces, historically, one of the pieces is that it was actually back in 1863 that the first Geneva Convention was actually formulated. So this is not a new law. It's been around for a while. It's been refined 4 times, and after the Second World War, it went in for its 4th revision. It is concerned with it is a law of war, and what it does is specify what are the limits in fighting any war, because wars are horrific. And can you humanize a war? Hence, why do you say international humanitarian war? That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to humanize the horrors of war. And so there are some principles that are written. Now, the United States has always supported the Geneva Conventions. We call it the law of armed conflict, but that's essentially the same piece. The international humanitarian law designation came about in the 1960s, but it's all part of the same, the names change, but it's the same intent. And the intent has 4 principles, 4 fundamental principles. And that is that the military whose job it is to fight a war and hopefully win the fight, right? That's what you're trying to do. That they have an obligation to conduct certain actions. Can they do anything they damn well please? No. And that's where the Red Cross steps in to say, you can do what's necessary in order to accomplish your goal for that particular mission, with the provision that you follow what we say are the limits, or the humanitarian limits. One of them is distinction. And distinction is a mandate that in any war situation, sides have to identify themselves. Remember, wars were usually fought not by individuals, they were fought by the armed forces, who usually designated themselves in some kind of outfit, a uniform of some kind. So you have to distinguish yourself, because the obligation is to fight somebody else who's a fighter. You are not allowed to fight a civilian. They're not supposed to take part, okay? You're supposed to be protecting the civilians. And therefore, distinction is extremely important. Now, you tell me, thinking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was there any protection of civilians? Of course not. There was no distinction whatsoever. So the Red Cross very soon thereafter said the use of nuclear weapons is a total violation of the Geneva Conventions, because they can't distinguish between killing off the combatants and killing off the civilians. And so step 1 there, that's one way of saying that nuclear weapons are then illegal, because they're going to involve civilians. Proportionality is another piece. Now, proportionality means you have to gauge in the military action that you're taking, why are you taking it, and is it in retaliation to something that already happened? And proportionality said it has to be measured by whatever your goals are. And your goals are not to eliminate the entire country and drive them into smithereens. That's not proportional. If you're reacting to something that they did, remember that it should be your action, your reaction to that must be proportionally fair. There has to be a concept of fairness. Now, there are times that we can think of when even the rhetoric has defied this, where we've heard that rhetoric not too long ago, when the rhetoric sounded like that the end point of any kind of action was going to be total elimination of an entire nation. Well, that's of course not. Can't be. Well, anyway, those are the concepts that why we say that the Geneva Conventions have already made the use of nuclear weapons illegal because they're violating, and certainly they are not reducing suffering.
Right.
I mean, not with the numbers, even in those
Right.
weapons that have already been used.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we're a bit running tight on time, so we'll have to be succinct as we move through some of these. I will be posting to my blog uh, some information beyond what we have time to cover during this 1 hour interview. So you can visit parallaxperspectives.org, and I'll mention this later on at the end of the program, and pick up some more information beyond what we had time to discuss right now. We've already talked about how the UN General Assembly had 122 nations saying yes, yes, let's pursue this, and in a number of ways, worldwide support for the treaty has been growing since 2017. And I've got information that I can post to my blog about that. Somebody's making a strong case why the European Union should join on, although the US has been staging nuclear weapons in a number of NATO countries and using other European nations to transport them. But we need to stop doing that kind of stuff. There's been really quite a lot of support worldwide through non-governmental organizations beyond what Joanne had time to talk about before, and a growing number of nations, especially in the global south, but increasingly in other countries as well. Can you tell us something about Ireland, which is one of the few nations in the global north that has come out with strong support?
Okay, well, let me. I don't think we've covered one piece that Ireland is an example of. When they wrote the treaty, remember, we're saying that nuclear weapons have already been illegal. So, what are the provisions of this particular treaty? Well, the provisions are, now listen to the range of verbs here,
Yes.
okay? That a country that signs on is prohibited from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring. Now, think about Ireland when I'm saying transferring, possessing, stockpiling, using, threatening to use, allowing stationary weapons to be placed within your country, assisting, encouraging, inducing anyone to engage, especially states with nuclear weapons. Now, that range of verbs means that once this treaty is ratified, if you have a company that is working and maybe producing a part of the nuclear weapon in your domain, that's illegal. That country now cannot produce those weapons. You really don't even want the presence of that country if it's producing weapons somewhere else. That country is not permitted to do anything in your country because you would be assisting by working with that company. You'd be assisting the production of nuclear weapons. Ireland was one of the very first nations to totally revamp, totally incorporate all of those provisions into its domestic legislation. Now, what did that mean? Well, we have a lot of nuclear weapons that are stationed in Europe. A lot of the airplanes stop in Shannon Airport for refueling if they're going to be heading over maybe to Turkey or someplace else. Sorry, not anymore. And the whole beauty of this particular treaty is that countries now will look to see they are not to encourage their neighbors. They are not to participate in any kind of lab work that is developing any of the future weaponry that might be related to nuclear weapons. They certainly can't store them anymore. And if they decided that they are storing them in this pace, there are 5 countries that are storing them, Belgium being one of them. Well, the Belgians are deciding now in their latest election, we don't want to store them anymore. We want to get rid of them. And they now have 77% of their population that wants to totally eliminate nuclear weapons within their borders. This is the hope of this treaty, that we're not even counting on the fact that the countries that have the nuclear weapons still want them, and they are saying we're deterring the rest of the world from using the weapons. Well, no,
Yeah,
because it hasn't worked. It hasn't stopped wars. And it does impede the fact that should the weapon go off, even accidentally, and they have gone off accidentally, people are going to be affected, and there's going to be civilians, and that's illegal.
right.
So this is the beauty of this treaty. And how do we get there? How do you make sure that governments are going to be encouraged to follow all the provisions? Well, that's what ICANN does. ICANN is sitting down right now with all those countries that have ratified the treaties, taking them step by step through what all these provisions mean, asking them to examine, well, what financially, what's going on in your country? Do you have some institutions that are supporting companies that are investing? They should divest. South Africa was one of the signatories. Well, apartheid is credited with no longer existing because of their divestment program. The South Africans were very verbal in using divestment as a very effective tool for eradicating an evil. Well, that's exactly what ICANN is saying. Make sure that you are beginning to divest. Who can divest? Banks can divest. Pension funds can divest. Governments can divest if they are putting their monies in some kind of, well, maybe laboratories that are creating, like in the United States, they have a range of university laboratories that are working on new parts for new weapons. No more. No more. Why don't the students in those countries and in those areas decide we don't want, or the alumni, we don't want you
Right.
working on that anymore. So this whole program, that's the beauty of
Right. And this is really taking off. There's an effort called Don't Bank on the Bomb that encourages people to take your money out of any banks that have any involvement with nuclear weapons. Students at
Code
universities
pink.
and alumni, Code Pink is one of the groups working on that. Alumni are pressuring their alumni associations to divest their endowment funds away from nuclear weapons companies. And people are getting insurance companies and other entities. We need to move on because we're tight on time, but there's a lot happening, and I'll post some information about this to my blog. And
Now, I think the other thing is there are 86 countries that have already signed on. Remember, we said signing is the first step. Now, of the 50 countries, the 51 countries already signed on, now ratified. Now we add to that another 86. They are anticipating that 16 of those 86 are probably within a month or two going to be ratifying that treaty. But the hope is that all 86 will ratify the treaty. That's going to bring the number up to 135. Well, that is exciting if I did my math right. I think I left out a couple of digits there. But anyway, that is extremely exciting. Now, if you're working on, there are only 193 nations in the world, of 135 of them, that's almost 3/5 of the world now that is going to be saying, we don't want the nuclear weapons. And if all of those countries are implementing all these provisions, think of all the companies that get impacted by that.
right,
Think of all the steps that get impacted.
right, and people at the grassroots level in these local communities throughout the world in various countries are doing that. And Joanne has a list that we don't.
Cities.
Yeah, Joanne has a list of progress of cities and other entities and public opinion polling shifts in a number of countries. We don't have time to share that now because we're quite short on time, but we'll be making that available through my blog. Within the United States, our nuclear weapons exist in the context of overall U.S. foreign policy. And for a very long time, the U.S. government and most American people have felt entitled to dominate other nations, to make war against them, to threaten nuclear war. This is just the default here in the United States for the past 3/4 of a century. So we need to do a major culture shift within the U.S. During an international crisis, when the president goes on TV and tells the American people and the rest of the world, all options are on the table, that's exactly what the president is saying. We've got this international crisis. All options are on the table. If that country that we're arguing with doesn't do what we tell them, we reserve the right to nuke you to death. So we need to deal with this. Indeed, since the 1960s, the United States has been specifically planning to start a nuclear war by launching nuclear weapons first. We've designed and built nuclear weapons specifically designed to accomplish a first strike. The idea is to destroy another nation's missiles while they're still in their silos before they launch them. And just 60 miles north of Olympia, 20 miles west of Seattle, in Kitsap County, the Trident nuclear submarine base is the biggest concentration of nuclear weapons anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. If Kitsap County were to secede from the US, it would be the third largest nuclear nation in the world after the balance of the US and Russia. And US foreign policy has been thoroughly bipartisan. Doesn't matter who's in the White House, doesn't matter who's in Congress, both political parties in our nation have been supporting the nuclear arms race and aggressively funding and aggressively planning first nuclear strikes. So it's not enough to have the election that we just had in the US recently. The nuclear arms race persists with strong support from both political parties, and it's up to us folks to change it. Fortunately, there's some smart legislation that's been introduced in Congress to significantly change the status quo. Unfortunately, there's not anywhere near enough political pressure in Congress to pass these. One of the clusters of smart policies is in the Back from the Brink campaign. Their website is www.preventnuclearwar.org. And this cluster of 5 smart policies are these, and we'll have more information on my blog. One is to renounce the option of using nuclear weapons first. 2 is to end the sole unchecked authority of any U.S. president to launch a nuclear attack. 3 is taking U.S. nuclear weapons off the hair trigger alert. 4 is to cancel the plans to replace the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal with all new enhanced nuclear weapons, and Congress has been funding that. And 5 is to actively pursue verifiable agreement among nuclear armed nations to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. And so that's compatible with the treaty. So we need to pursue this, and we're tight on time, so I need to rush through the next point here. They're really
just make the point here that because this is a global issue, that the Pope was one of the most significant people. The Vatican, remember, we said was the very first one to ratify the treaty, and he has been very significant in his message, as has the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yeah. And those leaders that really changed the thinking of those countries. So let us hope that their constituencies, we're talking about global constituencies here, along with the Secretary General of the United Nations, that people around the world will and are now coming to take this on as a cause.
So we do have allies in many places around the world. We need to support them. This billboard has been posted in a number of places in the greater Seattle area. In light of the treaty, it says nuclear weapons are now illegal. Get them out of Puget Sound. And it's supported by 2 great organizations that work against nuclear weapons. We do have, I want to show you also another resource. A decade ago, we brought to town the author of this book. He's a university professor from New York, as a historian. He wrote this book called Confronting the Bomb, A Short History of the World Nuclear Disarmament Movement. And his book documents the power that the peace movement does have when we organize and push effectively. He says that during those times when the movement has pushed back against nuclear weapons, we have indeed forced the U.S. government and other nations to adopt treaties, to pull back on policies that were going to be escalating. But when the peace movement has been quiet, those forces have moved ahead with more nuclear weapons. And we really need to be pushing vigorously.
Certainly was true during the last 4 years. There's an incredible push both in the funding and the expansion of the nuclear arsenal. Yeah. So, and that they were considered essential services. They are not essential.
Right.
Not if we're going to try to reduce nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan was threatening to blow up the world and just acting very irresponsibly, and the movement came along for a nuclear weapons freeze and other activities, the United Nations Second Special Session on Disarmament, Joanne was one of a million people in New York City at that big rally they had in 1982 calling for nuclear disarmament. And we actually made progress back then in a number of ways. I want to again mention the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, their website, www.icanw.org, and we'll have that posted on the blog. And there's been a huge amount of effort. A lot of the good national organizations include the Arms Control Association, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Union of Concerned Scientists, World Beyond War. And then at the regional level, here we have the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action right next door to the Trident Base in Kitsap County, Washington. In Tennessee at the Oak Ridge plutonium plant. Next to that, they have the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. Here in Washington State, Joanne and I and a lot of other people are active in Washington Against Nuclear Weapons, a statewide coalition that's been working for several years. Locally, we have the Olympia Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I'll information on all of that on my blog. We don't have time to list all of that here, but you can visit www.parallaxperspectives.org, and Parallax has one R and two L's, parallaxperspectives.org, and then you can click the nuclear weapons category and find lots and lots of information, and also the TV programs part to see this program that you're watching now and other programs that we've done in the past about nuclear weapons. In addition to the information I mentioned a moment ago, the blog helps you learn more about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's in the nuclear weapons category, along with a lot of other material. We need to wrap this up now. I want to thank Joanne, and I want to thank all the people who've been watching. We have a lot of things that we can do. We can make a lot of progress. We understand that nuclear weapons really are an extreme danger and therefore a very scary topic. Most people try to avoid paying attention to scary topics because they're just too scary. But what we need to do, and Joanne and I are working on, along with other people in our group, is to empower people to be able to deal with, learn about, and take positive, constructive actions on the hard.
And tell your neighbors about this treaty, and tell the legislators about this treaty, yes. Because it is the hopeful sign that if it actually is enforced, there won't be any more nuclear weapons for your grandchildren.
We can do that, yeah. So I also offer free online workshops about nonviolent grassroots organizing. And again, you can contact me with the information at the end of the program and through my blog. People really can make significant progress organizing for social, political, economic, other kinds of changes if we know how to do nonviolent grassroots organizing. And my workshops empower you and equip you to do that. And so you can get information about a lot of stuff through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. You can phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs the precise ways that you can plug in and help. So thanks for doing everything you possibly can. Thanks to Joanne, and thanks to all of you.